Hello to everyone. Please sit down, and we want to start with this new session. But before to service communication, the first, please write your name here, okay? That is a better way to meet us. The second point, you can find the Italian translation on the side of the desk. Then is it for me an honor and a pleasure to chair this session. It is an honor not only because of the distinguished speakers and discussants, but also because of the relevance of their contribution to development theory, development policy, but also development practice. In light of the paradigm of integral human development grounded in the Homo Integralis, and that aims to analyze the relationships across persons, communities, and structures, and the interactions across economy, society, and nature at local, national, and international level, development economics emerged as one of the most important fields for a renaissance in economics. This brings us to a key question. Is there a development economics anymore? Then we want to start with the first keynote speaker, Professor Ravi Kanbur. He's a professor of economics in Cornell University, and he has served on the senior staff of the World Bank, including as chief economist for Africa. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, hello. Yeah, is this open? Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to walk around here, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah, good. So, well, friends, greetings. In today's talk, I bring this provocation to the Guild of Development Economists, because, of course, we are a guild. We have our totems and our shibboleths. We have our heroines and our heroes. We have our founding myths and our grand figures in our history, and so on. So I'm not really going to pronounce the end of development economics, but perhaps raise some questions about what exactly it is that we've been doing, and what exactly is it that we should do. So that's the outline. I'm going to go around here. That's the outline. And this may be an odd sort of time to be asking this question. Why? Because, of course, the Guild has received a major imprimatur from the big Guild, the Economics Guild. Because remember, 2019, the Nobel Prize was awarded to Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo for their work in development economics. In 2015, the Nobel Prize in Economics went to Angus Deaton, at least partially for his work in development economics. And before this, there's a long gap going back to Arthur Lewis and to Gunnar Myrdal, both of whom will feature in my presentation. By the way, Amartya Sen's Nobel Prize was not for development economics, it was for welfare economics. And you should also know that the 2006 Nobel Prize to Muhammad Yunus was not for economics, it was for peace. And that may be the shame of economics, that's what the prize went for. And of course, leading universities have been establishing centers for the study of development, with development economics at their core over the past 2 decades, right up to the present. But despite all of this, I still want to raise the question, and I want to facilitate a conversation about a deeper understanding of what, if anything, is distinctive about what it is that we, who call ourselves development economists, do. And what then is the common thread that runs through development economics? Well, the most obvious candidate for a common thread is that development economics focuses on countries which are not upper-income countries. Right? In other words, they're below 13,935 according to the World Bank criteria. And these countries are themselves then divided into upper middle-income countries, low-income countries, etc., etc. That's the most obvious common thread. Is that what it comes down to? Are we an area studies grouping Is that what it is, except that it's now countries defined by per capita income as opposed to a geography? There are those people who work on Indonesia. There's a bulletin of Indonesian economic studies. Is that what development economics is? It's the study of countries whose per capita income is below some threshold. Is that all it is? Or is there perhaps a methodological similarity across the studies, the studies which self-define themselves as development economics, which sets them apart from other subdisciplines in economics? What distinguishes development economics from health economics, public economics, industrial economics? Or, thirdly, could there be a normative unity, not an analytical unity, but a normative unity, a focus on the poorest of the poor in the world, a sort of global Rawlsianism, which sets us development economists apart from other economists? Is that what it is? Which of these three? All of the above, none of the above? And how have those been evolving? Those are the questions I want to pose in this talk. So what I want to do, as I said, is I want to explore the distinctiveness of development economics and what has been happening to it under the rubric of these three questions or headings: classification and clustering, methodologies and models, and global Rawlsians and roles. Of course, these three topics, as you'll see, intersect and interact, but I think they may be a useful way of posing the question that I want to pose. So let's start with classification and clustering. Okay. The macro trends of the last 30 years or so have actually overturned the simple but more or less accurate mind picture of the world as divided between poor countries and non-poor countries, and with the bulk of the world's poor living in poor countries. Development economics was to be focused on the economics of those countries, which were thought to be analytically distinct and requiring different methodological approaches. And policy, in particular aid policy, was to be targeted towards these countries and their poor to lift them out of poverty. And for civil society and NGOs, there was a similar divide, with money being raised by rich NGOs in rich countries to be used by NGOs working in poor countries. This was the mind picture of this was a comfortable mind picture of 30, 40, 50 years ago. And as you all know, the mid-1970s, the World Bank introduced per capita income thresholds, which divided countries into low, middle, and upper income categories. And these thresholds, once established, have stayed constant in real terms. But the point is the reality on the ground has changed dramatically around these thresholds. And I don't need to belabor this point, but there's a website you can go to. But let me give you, since in interest of time, just give you some regional highlights. East Asia and Pacific. In 1987, 26% of the countries were low income. By 2024, only 3 remained in that category. The goalposts are shifting fast. Okay. Europe and Central Asia, no low-income countries in any of those 2 years. Latin America and Caribbean, low-income countries reduced from 1987 to 0 in 2024, while high-income countries increased. Just look at the last bullet. Sub-Saharan Africa, low-income countries decreased from 75% to 45%, with 1 country reaching high-income status. That's what's been happening in the last 30 years. The mind picture of 35 years ago was something. This is the current picture. So what's happening to this low-income, high-income classification as a category that I would propose was that first thing that defines development economics? Now, this is not the place to go into the many different clustering algorithms, which is a technical thing that we can talk about later. But I do have an intuition that over the last 30 years, the clustering into developed and developing in the conventional way has become considerably less sharp. Without going into any detail, let me consider just a simple intuitive example. Consider the world made up of 3 countries: Africa, China, and US. Time was when Africa and China were together low-income countries, and US was a rich country, and that was a dividing line between them. Developed, developing. 50 years ago. Okay? Now, in relative terms, China has moved away from Africa towards the US. So the between group difference in the means has decreased, which is the key element of clustering algorithms. And the within group component, the within group difference within the developing world has increased. China is now very different from Chad. Okay. So on both those dimensions, any standard clustering algorithm would give you a very much less sharp clustering than it was then. And this is income, but you always use income. No. Any human development indicator I put to you will give you this exercise. It will give you this result. And I put it to the younger researchers that there's a lot to be done in these types of exercises. Okay, so this is what I said. Yeah. So I leave these areas for future work. However, they lead to a second type of question. Is another reason for having development economics as a distinct subdiscipline that the methodologies are very different, given the quantitative and qualitative aspects of clustering? Is that the reason? Remember, that's the second of my things. Are the methodologies so different between us development economists as a group? Are they so similar among us and so different between us and health economics or public economics? Is that what makes, is that the distinction? Well, let's ask that question. So, what makes development economics economics, and what makes it development? Well, we've already looked at standard ways of making it development, the focus on poor countries, and have found that this way, the standard way, is running out of rope very fast. It's running out of rope very fast. And of course, the economics part of development economics leads to critiques from the other social sciences as being too narrow, unmoored from reality, leading to incorrect assessment and invalid policy prescription. Indeed, the severest critiques contend that the policy prescriptions are baked into the method and the whole thing is an ideological enterprise, but for particular types of economic and social arrangements. A lot of that will have been discussed and will be discussed in this group. Now, within economics, 50 years ago, development economists saw their methodology and approach as being distinctive compared to mainstream economics. They saw development economics as being better grounded in the reality of actual economies, where markets did not function as set out in the textbooks, and neither did individuals behave in textbook rational fashion. That's what 50 years ago, that was the defining rationale of the thing. And they saw the rest of economics, the last bullet, as being too mathematized, no room for qualitative accounts and analytical narratives. Now, Gunnar Myrdal's Asia Drama, or Albert Hirschman's Strategy of Development, or Arthur Lewis's Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor, are iconic works 50 years ago, 60 years ago, which capture that particular style of substance and reasoning that was the development economics that was. Gunnar Myrdal, as many of you will know, came to institutional economics, came to the institutional economics framing of Asian drama after having mastered and then turned away from high theory of his time. Myrdal was the head of the Stockholm School, the absolute top economic theory of the time. And he turned away from that towards institutional economics. And he brought that then to Asian drama. Arthur Lewis, his Nobel Prize-winning paper, has no equations and only a diagram or two. And Hirschman's work, of course, is steeped in narrative, building on his experiences in Latin American development projects. Now, this is an interesting thing. Paul Krugman, maybe I should stand and let's say, Paul Krugman indicted the Myrdal-Hirschman approach for the growing irrelevance of development economics as a subdiscipline in economics. Is there a bit of an echo? I'm sorry. I want to quote a little bit from Paul Krugman because I think it's important. Krugman says, Hirschman's book, Strategy, appeared at a critical point in this methodological crisis. It is a rich book full of stimulating ideas. Its most important message at that time, however, was a rejection of the drive towards rigor. In effect, Hirschman said that both the theorist and the practical policymaker could and should ignore the pressures to produce buttoned-down, mathematically consistent analyses and adopt instead a sort of muscular pragmatism in grappling with the problem of development. Who needs all this mathematics? Who needs all these models, okay? That is Krugman's characterization of Hirschman. Along with some others, notably Myrdal, Hirschman didn't wait for intellectual exile. He proudly gathered up his followers and led them into the wilderness himself. Unfortunately, they perished there. That's Krugman, not me. This is Krugman saying. See, Krugman's, and it's important to note, Krugman's indictment was not that the ideas in Hirschman and Myrdal were irrelevant. That's very important to realize this, okay? Quite the contrary. The insights on interlinkages, increasing returns, etc. were central, according to Krugman. But they would not and could not have an impact on the profession in the mode in which they were developed and transmitted. According to Krugman, the insights of Myrdal and Hirschman did not grab the attention until formal simple models like the ones in Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny came about. That is Krugman's analysis. That is Krugman's analysis of what happened. And here's the two final quotes from him, very interesting. Myrdal's effective presentation of the idea of circular and cumulative causation, or Hirschman's evocation of linkages, was stimulating and immensely influential in the 1950s and early 60s. But by the 70s, when I was myself a student of economics, they had come to seem not so much wrong as meaningless. What were these guys talking about? Okay. Where were the models? And so high development theory was not so much rejected as simply bypassed. This is Krugman's account of what happened. And of course, the state of affairs presaged and wished for by Krugman is now upon us. It's now upon us. Okay? A generation of economists, and I have to say myself among them, wanted development economics to be methodologically on par with the rest of economics. We did not want soft methods for poor countries. Okay? That was our push. Okay? The vaunted top 5 journals in economics are now replete with development economics papers. I don't need to tell you that. And the state of affairs would have been unthinkable even 3 decades ago, let alone when Myrdal, Hirschman, and Lewis were in their prime. And of course, this trend in development economics has been part of an overall trend in economics towards methodological convergence in theory and empirics. In the empirical work, the causality or credibility revolution is now dominant and absorbs much of the attention of young economists, including, of course, in development economics. I'm myself a critic of the randomistas, but I'm describing to you what is going on. I'm presenting a positive analysis of what's going on. In the realm of theory and conceptualization, many of the old development economics perspectives on departure of individual choice behavior from textbook rational choice theory are now seen as very much part of mainstream economics. So there's been movement in the other direction as well. Okay? So we used to think, you know, these poor farmers are myopic. But actually, we have papers in the QJE now with titles like, "Why do New York City taxi drivers stop work early on rainy days?" Mm-hmm. I mean, myopia as a standard piece of analysis is now absolutely central. I mean, we had a lecture on behavioral economics earlier. Okay? So as I said, the idea that poor rural peasants were more bound by myopia or social conventions than their city counterparts has been belied by several decades worth of research into behavioral economics. So there's been a homogenization in both directions, so to speak. So the idea that what distinguished developed economics was that they had, and also the idea that what distinguished developed economies was that they had better functioning markets, has been questioned by the financial crises that gripped the world in 1997 and 2008. See, that was what was different about developing countries. Their markets didn't function, whereas the markets function well over there. No, they don't. They didn't. Of course, context matters. Don't tell me context matters, but the point is it matters everywhere. Okay? And the notion that you can now have a grand distinction between developed countries which are very like each other, developing countries which are very like each other, and they differ from each other, back to the clustering, I think is questioned more and more and more. So let me then turn to the third topic. So perhaps what distinguishes us development economists is a normative concern for the poorest of the poor in the world, and our drive to deploy the best analytical firepower there is in economics to develop policies and interventions to address their concerns. Is that what draws us together? Is that what unites us and separates us from the rest of economics, other economists? Right? Well, I've already indicated this chain of reasoning might be questioned in purely descriptive or positive analytic terms. As I said, the number of countries in the low-income category is falling, and countries are crossing from the low and middle income to upper middle income category at a very healthy clip. So unless we shift the goalposts continuously, unless we make the categories move, and therefore keep our relevance as still being whatever, this method of distinguishing countries of focus is running out of scope. As I said, I now want to turn to the normative core of the proposition that our concern should be focused on the poorest of the poor globally, no matter where they are. See, if that was the root, then that would unite us all together. Okay? Because that is where the poor are, so we work on those countries because that is where the poor are. And of course, this will be recognized as a globalizing of roles. Indeed, the self-described global Rawlsians drew on the philosophical foundations laid down by Rawls in his theory of justice. And the project and debates surrounding it intersect with cosmopolitanism and other debates in philosophy. The most famous and iconic setup is that of Peter Singer. Again, I don't need to tell people in this room that. If the resources saved by not giving your child a favorite toy as a birthday present could ensure that the poverty of an anonymous child thousands of miles away could be alleviated, it is morally incumbent upon you to follow this course of action. Ergo, for us analysts, it is morally incumbent upon us to use our analytical firepower to work on the poorest of the poor. That's the analogy. That might link us all together. That might tie us all together. However, I have to say the globalizing roles project and cosmopolitanism generally is not without its critics. First, many philosophers, like my late Cornell colleague, Richard Miller, have resisted the downplaying of familial and other linkages in Singer-like examples, both empirically and conceptually. This is not the place to go into those philosophical things in detail. But secondly, more structurally, a famous philosopher has critiqued the globalizing of roles. And that famous philosopher is Rawls. Mm-hmm. The critique of Rawls, of global Rawlsianism, is the following. A contractarian theory of justice like that of Rawls, whose object is to set out the contours of the contract between sovereign and subjects, becomes unmoored when the sovereign cannot be specified or identified. You need a sovereign in order for a contractarian theory of justice to take root. For a nation state, the sovereign and the subject can indeed be identified, however imperfectly. In this sense, the nation state has moral salience. But who is the sovereign at the global level? Not easy to identify. Of course, this does not mean that one cannot have theories of justice at the global level. It is just that they cannot quite so easily be a simple globalization of roles. You cannot sort of check off the box of roles and say, ergo, I have a moral justification of being a development economist. You cannot use that route. Nation states matter, not just instrumentally, but they have moral salience too. To put it in its sharpest and most contentious form to you, the Rawlsian framework does not provide a moral route to skipping over the homeless in the streets of London or Paris or Rome to give priority to the analysis of poverty in poorer nation states. You could use other methods, sure, but not the Rawlsian contractarian approach quite so easily, and quite so unthinkingly, I might add. So finally, I want to note that in these discourses in high philosophy, Rawls, Singer, etc., have their echoes in the changing public attitudes towards development assistance, which has been long the mainstay of development economics for its rationale and its finance, let's face it. Why should the average person in a rich country be taxed to raise money for assistance to a poorer country when one, that country is rich, are buying up factories in the rich country. Two, that poorer country has a nuclear weapons program. Three, that country has a space program. Four, the country has its own aid program. This is what you find in town halls around the world in the North these days, and it's very closely linked to the philosophical debates that I mentioned to you about roles and global roleism. For all of these reasons, I believe that the common thread of development economics as a morally coherent normative enterprise is no longer self-evident and is beginning to fray ever so slightly. So, let me then retrace the arc of my narrative and conclude. I have explored the coherence of development economics as a distinct branch of economics, and I've done so under three, albeit overlapping, headings. First, from a clustering and classification perspective, development economics is a study of a group of countries which are similar to each other, but very different from the other group along economic dimensions, particularly income. Well, this works to some extent, and of course it's continuing to work. I'm not saying it's all gone, okay? Don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is that this is running out of rope fast as countries traverse the country classifications that were set up in the good old days. Second, development economics is having a distinct methodological approach compared to the other branches of economics. This can be argued to have been the case 50 years ago, at the time of Hirschman, Lewis, and Myrdal, but it is no longer the case. There has been a methodological convergence in both directions, across the whole of economics, and development economics is no exception. Third, development economics as a distinct normative project with a focus on the poorest of the global poor. If that is indeed the case, then its coherence can be questioned empirically, certainly empirically, in terms of the positioning of the global poor across country income categories. But as important as this, is that there is at least a debate on whether or not a focus on each country's poor taken separately, including the poor in rich countries, should be on par with a focus on the poor in poor countries. We have to realize that there are good arguments in that direction. For all of these reasons, I see the distinction between development economics and economics in general as being increasingly untenable. Of course, institutional inertia, we needn't worry, folks, here. Institutional inertia will keep things going on for a while. Hiring lines will continue to be designated as being for development economics, and development economic centers will continue to be set up for a while longer. Development aid ministries will continue to generate some demand for personnel, even as they pivot to refugees and migration or global public goods, such as climate change or pandemics. But mostly on present trends, I think the distinction between development economics and economics will, not immediately, but over a decade or three, simply wither on the vine. I suppose one way of re-putting the question in the title is there a development economics anymore would be, aren't we all development economists now? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very rich and probably stimulate us to reflect about this interaction between development economics and economics. And probably my suggestion could be interesting to also introduce another plan of analysis about this relationship that could be the school of thought, no? Because you have speaking about economics and development economics, but the success or the failures of some development theories are probably also the result of success and failure of different kind of approach, like Keynesian approach, post-Keynesian, or neoclassical approach. As in the case, you say causality or credibility revolution could be also another interpretation about marginal revolution that influenced also the debate about development policies, as in the case the policies of World. I remember the famous book of Andrea Corni about the adjustment with the human face. It is interesting, okay, but we could speak about this also in other in other conference, in the next conference on next and economy. Put the manifesto also within the school, the different school of thought. Otherwise, if we only speak about economics, probably we do not consider the entire economic thought. But thank you very much. The next keynote speaker is Phoebe Koundouri. Is a professor at the School of Economics, Department of International and European Economic Studies in University of Athens. She is the founder and scientific director of the Alliance of Excellence for Research and Innovation, Euphoria, probably this is the pronunciation, and she also visiting professor of Cambridge University. They are the main roles. I know that we have many different positions. That please, Feb, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really sad that I'm not there this year. I was there last year, and it was fully exciting. And I was also listening very carefully to the previous keynote by Ravi. Indeed, are we all development economists now? I think yes. It was a beautiful keynote, and I thank you deeply for giving me the opportunity to listen to it. Now, what I'm going to present is something a bit out of the box, which is my work of the last 30 years, accumulating into an operational framework for development. And since I was a kid, I love this quote: "You don't discover electricity by perfecting the candle." And that is why frontier science matter, and that is why I'm a proud grantee of ERC, just because it allows me to look beyond the frameworks and beyond the disciplines. My work tries to identify systems transformation for the sustainable interaction between nature, economy, and society as the roadmap to development. And for me, both developing and developed countries and the subsections in these huge categories that are now blurred between them, the boundaries are blurry, like Ravi said, are all relevant for this framework. So very quickly, because I only have 15 minutes, I think all agree that we are in a difficult almost permanent multi-crisis, and that we are trying to find the pathways away from this crisis. And I'm going to claim here that the pathways away from this crisis are the pathways that explicitly connect natural capital in terms of the biosphere, the society, and the economy into operational frameworks that identify explicit implementation pathways. So I believe that one of the major causes of our permanent multi-crisis is our working in silos of the systems, in silos of the sciences, in silos of categorizations of countries, and so on. And to break those silos and silence of solutions, we need to understand the systems that are operating within a scale that we want to investigate, and understand what interdisciplinary science suggests as a framework what stakeholders understand and are given capacity to co-design. And of course, science can suggest interdisciplinary science, that is socioeconomic and earth sciences. What stakeholders want to see as their future, so stakeholder co-design. And then, of course, when you're articulating this science-based stakeholder co-design pathways away from the multi-crisis, you also need to answer the question, who is going to finance the implementation of the pathways you co-design between science and stakeholders? And of course, whatever you design has to be open access, true open access, providing the data, the models, the recommendations, but also the capacity for understanding what is there that you are offering. So it's not enough for me to be able to reach your conclusions or recommendations in some form. I really need to have the capacity to understand what you're talking about and what you are recommending. And here I'm going to also claim that the real constraint is not data. We have enough. Not all the data that we would want, but we have enough, and we have AI-aided data development. We also have enough of knowledge, science, and technology, and money between the public and private sector. What we are missing is the capacity, transparency, accountability, and translation of public goals into investable projects, long-term needs into fund-compatible assets, and risks that exist to risks that are priced and allocated. So here I'm saying this is an operational framework for designing and implementing sustainable, interdisciplinary, science-based, stakeholder co-design and blended finance supported open access transformative pathways towards sustainable development. And we have all the ingredients for it, but we don't really work in a way that can bring all the ingredients together and produce the transformative science that is needed. The work that I'm showing is a work that derives from the Alliance of Excellence for Research and Innovation on IFORIA, which includes 3 different research centers that I lead in an alliance on research and innovation, innovation acceleration, and science policy interface. More than 200 researchers with projects in more than 120 countries. And what I am going to present to you here is the backbone of the global SDR, the Global Sustainable Development Report of the United Nations, which is the flagship assessment on the global level of implementation of the SDGs, the global level of implementation of sustainable development. This is my suggestion as the co-chair of this report, and the report will be out before the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development and will be the basis for the deliberations of sustainable development. Our main mandate is to do an assessment of assessments of the situation that we are and provide evidence-based policy guidance for accelerated, integrated action, and at the same time lay the foundations for the Beyond 2030 agenda. And let me say here that we have achieved a lot since 2015. 196 countries have signed the agenda for the SDGs as their development manuscript. 193 submitted voluntary reports. Across the world, we have alignment of policy frameworks with the SDGs, not just in Europe, but across the world. And we have achieved 20% level of implementation of the SDGs. 20% is not a lot, but we have achieved much more than implementation, because you cannot start implementing the day you have an agreement, right? There is a lot of preparation before implementation. However, one issue with the SDGs and the guidance as targets for development is that they provide direction, but there is no robust structural framework that operationalizes them and allows their implementation at scale. So what I am proposing that I believe creates the capacity, transparency, accountability, and coordination to deliver the SDGs, to deliver sustainable development, is a three-step approach. And this approach can be implemented at global, regional, national, institutional, company scale, any scale actually. And it composes of step one, continuous measurement, monitoring, and assessment with regards to where you are in implementing the holistic and integrated framework of the SDGs that really integrates biosphere, the stock of flows of resources with the economy and the effects on society, effects on fairness, equality, cohesion. Once you measure, you are able to see the gap between where you are and where you want to go. And in step two, you sketch development pathways in order to close that gap by the dates that your national commitments indicate. Your national commitments are included in international treaties, but also in national commitments as a country. There, what we do, we create a digital twin, completely mathematical representation of the natural system with the different stocks of natural resources, depletable and renewable, with the flows of ecosystem services. Then we have the layer of human infrastructure, then the layer of the economy in general equilibrium and partial equilibrium analysis, and then the layer of society in terms of socioeconomic impacts. And at this stage of this digital twin modeling and integration, we consult with the stakeholders. We have at the moment more than 70 living labs across the world that create representative stakeholder roundtables of different countries, of group of countries, where we discuss the initial problems, map the initial problems, and validate the initial conditions of the modeling, validating the results, discussing and validating results of each iteration of the digital twin. And once you got validated short, medium, and long run pathways for transformation that derive from the integrated mathematical modeling of the digital twin, you need to ask the question, okay, the ministries agree this is something that they want to endorse. How do we finance? And basically what you have is investment portfolios at different scales. For example, if you're working for countries, invest the portfolio of a country that needs to be financed And there we all know that all the public money of the world will never be enough. We need to de-risk our projects to make them risk adjusted and bankable. And if you have fiscal space, you are more in the category of a more developed country, and you have fiscal space, then you use public finance to de-risk your projects and attract private investors. If you are in the space where fiscal space is not there, and most probably in the developing category that Ravi introduced his lecture with, which I agree is now not well defined, then you need multilateral financing in order to de-risk your projects and bring in finance. At the end of the day, what we have is a completely open access, global commons, and this is step 2, right? I am detailing step 2, which is a digital AI-ready infrastructure that brings together all the data you need for your modeling, socioeconomic, geospatial, real time, that brings together all the models you need to integrate, the biophysical models that represent your environmental and natural resource boundaries, embedded in the planetary boundaries framework of IASA. And then by understanding that you need to go in the beyond GDP framework, meaning that you are not only looking at produce capital, but also natural capital, human capital, cultural capital as well. And we created a global digital platform that allows you to collect of existing valuation methods of these different forms of capital and monetize different, for example, natural capital in different countries. You are able to have a beyond GDP representation of your modeling. And here, before you go into the economic modeling, in the beyond GDP socioeconomic modeling, you need to solve for the energy model, the transport model, the water model, the land use model, the marine use model. We have country level, but also sub-country and regional level models for each of these sectors, which identify what is the optimal mixtures of technologies and transformations that you need to implement in each of the sector. And this model are softly integrated so that what you propose to the energy ministry is consistent with what you propose at the transport ministry, land use, and so on. So these identify the synergies and the trade-off. And once you have this softly integrated solution between all the sectors of the economy, you embed them in the beyond GDP economic model in order to identify the effects on different sectors, income groups, trade, and also who are the most vulnerable in this transition.
Sorry, Phoebe.
Okay, I'm close.
Thank you.
Give me
so
1 minute to close.
Please,
yes.
Thank you.
While you are doing all this, you are focused, again, on stakeholder engagement, equity, fairness, and inclusion. Your models allows you to do that. And also understanding that you are creating a global commons where all the scientists are welcome to share their data. We will make it interoperable to upload models that are competing or integratable with the models we already have. And in this way, you create accountability because any other stakeholders, the policymakers, the businesses, the financiers, the technology developers, the civil society can get up here, and we give training courses for this to see recommended solution. And in this way, you create transparency and accountability. At the end of the day, you can identify the free riders, and you can identify those that are not cooperating in a way that it becomes explicit with numbers. And once again, I'm closing with this, you need the stakeholders on board, and these are the 70 plus living lab around the world where the solutions are being discussed. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Phoebe Koundouri. Thank you so much. At the end, we have the discussant, Professor Carlo Pietrobelli, Professor of Economics at Roma Tre University, but is also UNESCO Chair at the United Nations University in Maastricht, and he's also lead economist of the Inter-American Development Bank. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giulio. It's really a pleasure to be here and be able to give a few comments to these two excellent keynote presentations. I was born a development economist myself, so I'm especially moved by listening to what Ravi has been telling us and discussing the key ideas there. And I would like to try to make three statements for my comments. The first one has to do with the quantitative motivation. This is not working well. Scusate, questo funziona? Does this work? Okay. All right. So the first statement has to do with the quantitative reasoning that Ravi gave us, arguing essentially that low-income countries are disappearing, which I agree with this statement, but I would emphasize that there's several elements that need to be considered, and he himself raised these elements these considerations in some of his papers. First of all, we need to talk about poor people, not necessarily poor countries. So within countries, there's notable poverty, and poverty persists in developing and developed, advanced, or middle income, or low income, or upper middle income, and so on. Secondly, there's this dimension of relative poverty that we need to remember as well, and looking and focusing on the lower end of the income distribution, also in advanced countries like ours, is relevant, and I think is within the domain of a development economics approach. And thirdly, what we discover from the statistical analysis and the insights that Ravi gave us is that we are observing, we used to study the third world, the second world, the third world, so-called. Now we are different worlds and huge heterogeneity of countries. So, and even looking at income and using income to generate groupings of countries is sometimes not effective at all. Because within the same group, with the same level of incomes, we may have countries as different as Kuwait and Japan, or as Guatemala and Bangladesh and others. So, I don't know, quantitative motivation, I buy it, but to some extent. Secondly, traditional development economics used to deal with issues such as the famous productive dualism, the famous Lewis and Rannis and Fay model, whereby dualism can be productive through the process of migration of unlimited surplus of labor to the modern economy, to industry, to the city. Industrialization could help the country develop. And we learned from traditional, so to speak, development economists that the typical issues, the typical questions that were addressed by them have to do with inequalities, have to do with the specific features of rural realities, the typical issue of lacking, fragmented, little trustworthy institutions and lack of confidence in institutions. And you'll probably remember the long debate on appropriate technology and the adoption of appropriate technology and what that is. That reminds me of the names of Francis Stewart and several others, and Rafi Kaplinsky and many others. But these problems are problems of advanced countries today. This is what I would argue. We see productive dualism worldwide, in advanced countries as well. I would expect the increasing adoption of digital and artificial intelligence technology is likely to increase dualism and widen the gap between the different groups of society. We are facing tremendous inequalities. The globalization paradox, we were expecting globalization to help countries converge somehow, but they're not. They are diverging, or they are converging downward, and they are converging towards lower levels of welfare and income and so on. So again, a typical traditional subject of traditional development economics. New technologies favoring educated professionals, widening dualism. We've seen studies on wages in different sectors and classified by education. We discover that the more educated end up gaining higher and higher wages and so on. That's the issue of financial dualism, with those holding financial assets gaining more and more and more than the others. Deindustrialization and the limited production of employment in societies. The increasing obstacles faced by minorities. We started acknowledging the existence of a variety of minorities, from migrants to racial, ethnic minorities, gender-related minorities, low-educated minorities, and the pervasive issue of crime and drugs and low trust in government and lack of confidence in governments. These are all problems that we live in advanced countries as well. So I think that the old traditional school, improved with more technical and quantitative and rigorous techniques, still has something to say to address the problems that a variety of different countries are facing, including advanced countries. And thirdly, and final statement, I think we need a useful development economics. We've all observed, I also took part to some extent in this well-known RCT, the randomistas revolution that has been sweeping development studies over the last couple of decades, and the Nobel Prizes and so on. I think this has been positive. Don't misunderstand me, but this has been very positive. But at the same time, I think that developing economics should go back again and ask and try to answer the big questions of development, which are not only related to specific projects, specific experiences, which is useful to know and find out, but the real impact is given by different things. And sometimes we forget that we should really address the big problems, the big questions. So, big questions, I listed a few. Why South Korea grew rich and Mozambique, Guatemala, Honduras, and others did not? What explains growth? What explains industrialization? How can climate change and sustainability, we listen to Phoebe right now, become opportunities and not only constraints? How can we make it compatible? What is the challenge there? What is the role of geography, human capital, institutions? And most remarkably, the final point, what is the necessary role and capacities of the state? How can we help nurture the necessary capabilities and the collaboration that we acknowledge is relevant between the state, the business sector, civil society, research institutions, and so on? These are all big challenges that I think development economics should address. How can I end here? Ravi gave a final sentence that was not in his PowerPoint or papers, which is, how we all develop an economist now. I think we are. I think we should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also to Carlo Pietrobelli, and then I think that it's not possible to have some specific conclusion, only some little point. The first, the relevance of the awareness about the relevance of the economic ideas, to better understand then also the history of economic thought, the awareness about the evolution of theories, because it's very important also to understand the development theories, the development economics. Another point, development economics should first of all address with ends. This means address with the priorities and political priorities. And this does not mean a reduction of rigor, a reduction of rationality, but that means another kind of challenge. Use techniques, use different kind of intelligence. Use means use them as instrumental for human development. At the end, development studies can remind all economists that a true renaissance in economics must also address the international contradiction and challenges of the global economic system in terms of digital divide, inequality, poverty, and environmental degradation, by transforming the pillars of our manifesto into new drivers for development policies and international cooperation. Probably we should open more the manifesto to the global south. Thank you so much. And please, so you can see on the screen the other seminar, semi-plenary that I think start in a few minutes, that please go in your semi-plenary session.